Is Europe really of such little importance? At present, the Europeans are striving to find their appropriate role, or rather, any role at all, in the peace negotiations for Ukraine. For at the latest, since the announcement of Trump's new security strategy, it has become clear the United States is becoming less and less reliable, and it is increasingly orienting itself toward Russia. My name is Regina Steffens, and in our shortcut today, we are looking at the question, what steps is Europe actually taking to guide the peace process in favor of Ukraine? My guest today in the shortcut studio is Maximilian Popp. Max, you're the deputy head of our foreign desk. Together we want to explain today how the Europeans are trying to make their voices heard and to prevent being sidelined by Russia and the USA. I am glad that you are here today. Thank you very much. Max, in recent weeks we have been able to observe how European heads of government keep making phone calls, meeting, and trying to find wise words when it comes to a peace solution for Ukraine. How do you perceive this group? Do they appear nervous, or are they under pressure? Or do they appear confident? He may have revealed it, but it still can't be ruled out. After all, Max, several heads of government are meeting with Zelensky in London today, including Merz, Stamer, and Macron. Already yesterday, Zelensky held talks with the Americans. So, ongoing discussions are taking place repeatedly to further advance this process. Now it is the Europeans' turn again. In what exactly does their disagreement show? I'm not sure one can speak of disagreement, but these meetings between Zelensky and the Europeans, which now take place almost weekly, seem largely symbolic to me. Because ultimately, they cannot conceal the fact that, in the end, it will not be the Europeans who decide on the end of the war in Ukraine, but essentially Trump, Putin, and possibly Zelensky. Therefore, the Europeans are, in a sense, standing on the sidelines, appearing busy and waving eagerly, but it remains unclear what they are actually talking about with Zelensky and what their concrete plan is. There, I think, prevails a great emptiness, a state of profound perplexity. At least, research by our colleagues last week made it clear that the European heads of government are united on one point, namely, in their distrust of the United States. A crisis call took place, fitting with the numerous meetings and phone conversations of these days, and in the corresponding transcript it said, for example, that Friedrich Merz had emphasized Zelensky must be extremely cautious in the coming days, because they're playing games, both with you and with us. The Finnish president also emphasized that Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky must under no circumstances be left alone with these people, meaning the American negotiating team. Are they really only in agreement when it comes to mistrust? An extremely revealing document, as it highlights the discrepancy between what Europeans say publicly about the Trump administration and what they apparently really think about it. And of course this mistrust is justified. After all, they must fear that in the end Trump will strike a deal with Putin that simply bypasses the Europeans. That is an extremely realistic scenario. What is not sufficient, however, is merely complaining about it. Rather, what matters is what is actually necessary and what would already have been required in the past months. At the latest since Donald Trump took office, and especially through the speech by Vice President J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference in February, in which he already made it clear that he basically does not care about the Europeans, this has become evident. Since then, a clear strategy has been needed for how defense can be organized independently of the United States. How one can avoid having to travel to Trump every 2 to 3 weeks to ask him to continue supplying weapons, and I think far too little has been done in this regard. That simply does not do justice to the drama of the moment. What the Europeans have undertaken is simply inadequate. The drama of the current situation lies in the fact that Putin is continuing his war of aggression undeterred. Only last weekend, there were once again massive attacks. According to reports, people in Ukraine currently have only about 3 hours of electricity per day. The situation is therefore extremely urgent. The dramatic aspect of the current situation is that, after almost 4 years, Ukraine is in danger of losing this war. In the east, especially in the Donbass, they are continually losing territory and are also being relentlessly terrorized from the air. The urgency of the situation also lies in the fact that the entire European security order is being called into question. Of course, it is being called into question by Putin, but also by Donald Trump. You just mentioned that an appropriate strategy should have already existed when Trump took office. He has already been in office for several months, yet a clear strategy still seems to be lacking. What would such a strategy have to look like? First, there would need to be an understanding that the USA and Donald Trump are simply not reliable partners. At least not a partner one can really rely on. You already mentioned the US national security strategy, in which Trump explicitly sets this out. That shows his contempt for Europe, the European democracies, and the European Union, and he even goes so far as to say that opposition to them should be encouraged. That means it is not a partner one can rely on. So, what should one do instead? Well, one must rely on one's own strengths. After all, we are a large and influential economic area. We would certainly have the means to further expand our own defense. We would also have even more far-reaching possibilities to support Ukraine. For example, I am thinking of the sanctions that have already been imposed. In the European Union, we now have 19 sanction packages. But we still obtain energy from Russia, Hungary, Slovakia, and other countries almost without restraint. Another aspect concerns the frozen Russian assets, which are currently being discussed intensively. This amounts to 140 billion euros. There are currently considerations to use these funds to support Ukraine. However, even on this point, the EU member states have so far been unable to reach an agreement, as Belgium in particular, where the money is held, is blocking a compromise. In short, I simply miss the necessary determination. If we delve a little deeper into the topic, sanctions and frozen assets, you already mentioned that it mainly depends on individual member states. How can these states be convinced? Perhaps first a quick look at the initial situation. The problem is that the United States is currently no longer financing the delivery of weapons to Ukraine. The United States supplies the weapons or sells them to the Europeans, who then pass them on to Ukraine. For this, the Europeans naturally require enormous financial resources, which are gradually running out. This gave rise to the idea of using the Russian state assets frozen in Belgium to finance support for Ukraine. I consider that an exceptionally sound approach. However, there are legal concerns within the EU about implementing this approach. Especially in Belgium, there are concerns about being sued by Russia later and then being left without sufficient funds to repay the money to Russia. Therefore, Belgium, in my view quite understandably, is asking the EU member states for guarantees for the, albeit rather unlikely but possible, case that Russia prevails in court and payments become due. In that event, the financial responsibility should not rest solely with Belgium, but be secured through commitments from the EU member states. But many continue to be hesitant on this issue. The French are hesitant because they are struggling with difficulties in their own budget, and the Southern Europeans are also reserved, as they are wondering whether it is really necessary. And why is the money actually in Belgium? The financial services provider Euroclear is based in Belgium. It is a technically complex process that is handled through Belgium. Now, however, the matter is inevitably becoming a political issue, since Belgium, again, not entirely without reason, is concerned about the stability of its own financial center. Belgium would have to rely more on its European partners and be able to place greater trust in them. Time and again, we return to the central question of whom one can truly trust and who provides security to whom. On the subject of sanctions, 19 sanction packages have already been adopted, which relate, among other things, to the import of oil. These are economic sanctions that have so far shown little effect. We would like to discuss which measures the EU is already taking to create peace, or at least to deliberately guide this process. Obviously not, because Putin is continuing his war of aggression unchanged and without any weakening. That means the economic losses he has partly suffered apparently have not impressed him very much. One could now argue that economic sanctions may not be the appropriate course of action. I think one could also say that we may not have acted consistently enough. Perhaps the problem is that countries like Hungary and Slovakia continue to import oil from Russia, and we ourselves still, albeit indirectly, for example via detours such as through India, obtain gas from Russia. Ultimately, this means that we continue to let money flow into Russia's war chest. Ultimately, it comes down to this: Putin will end this war only when he himself considers it necessary. That means he will act only when his calculation changes and he comes to the conviction that continuing the war no longer brings him any greater advantage than ending it. At present, he is quite obviously convinced that it is strategically more sensible for him to continue this war. This calculation must be changed, because at present Ukraine, especially in the Donbass, is in a difficult situation. Therefore, Putin is naturally convinced that he merely has to keep fighting until Ukraine eventually collapses at some point. He originally believed that this would happen after only a few days or weeks. But that did not happen. The war has now lasted nearly 4 years, and yet his strategic thinking seems to have remained essentially unchanged. He is convinced that he can gradually wear down Ukraine. Max, when we turn our gaze from the EU toward Ukraine, we see Zelensky there, who finds himself in a kind of supplicant role and keeps appealing, "Please help us," while at the same time trying to use his contacts and connections at every level. And how does he view, or how is it seen from the Ukrainian perspective, the EU's uncertain struggle to find a clear role? That must be extremely frustrating and exhausting. I mean, this country has been stuck in this war for almost 4 years now, actually even longer if you don't count the beginning only from the major invasion. Zelensky travels the world, always in search of financial support and further assistance. He appears, as you aptly say, time and again as a supplicant and must each time fear anew being completely abandoned. Added to this are the current domestic political difficulties, above all the corruption scandal he is currently struggling with. I think it is no exaggeration to say that Zelensky and Ukraine are currently in the most difficult phase since the start of the war of aggression in 2022. A second citizenship? Getting one is easier than you think. It's much more than just a plan B. It's your key to true freedom. Our free guide to countries. Max, let's discuss and summarize this once more. What is the EU currently doing? So, there are currently many meetings and discussions. However, you say that this is basically all just symbolic. Big words without real substance. But behind closed doors, people seem to be largely in agreement and to assess the situation very realistically. Because, to put it bluntly, we no longer really want to trust the USA or continue negotiating with them. What was actually neglected, however, is the consistent development of a clear strategy. What is the EU currently doing in concrete terms to assume a constructive role in the peace process and to shape it effectively? Quite a lot. It is by no means the case that the EU has remained inactive. Weapons deliveries and financial support are being provided to Ukraine. Moreover, the country has been offered a concrete EU membership perspective. So a great deal has already happened, and I certainly do not want to appear one-sided in this regard. I want to expressly acknowledge that, because none of this is easy. After all, these are matters of war and peace, of life and death. We are not only talking about the EU here, but basically also about other European states. The United Kingdom is also heavily involved, especially when it comes to issues of security policy. A great deal has already developed, and I also think it is right that people are trying to exert influence on Trump. Every effort should be made to ensure that he does not ultimately conclude an extremely disadvantageous deal at the expense of Ukraine. Instead, as was already the case with the 28-point plan, the goal is to correct him and mitigate the most serious impositions mitigates the unreasonable demands towards Zelensky and Ukraine. These diplomatic efforts are undoubtedly right, and I do not want to be misunderstood in any way. However, one must not rely on Trump ultimately doing what is necessary, or on him not, in the end, agreeing to a deal with Putin that comes at the expense of Europe and Ukraine. After all, a decision is to be made on December 18th, that is, already in the coming week, on how to deal with the frozen assets and whether there is any progress in this matter. My final question to you. Who in Europe do you count on to actually take the initiative and say, we are developing a clear strategy and want to take on a stronger role in these negotiations? I think ultimately it is the players who have already been visible and present in recent months, above all, of course, Friedrich Merz. These are the leading member states of the European Union. Ultimately, it will depend on France with Emmanuel Macron, as well as on the United Kingdom with the so-called Coalition of the Willing, and on Poland, which has already advanced this initiative. December 18th represents a decisive turning point for Europe. These frozen assets may sound like a technical issue, but ultimately, the central question will be decided on this day. Will there continue to be financial resources to support Ukraine, or will the aid run out in the foreseeable future? An end to all foreign support would be a catastrophe for Ukraine. For in that case, they would soon find themselves in a situation where they could no longer defend themselves and would run a serious risk of either being overrun by Russia or being forced into an agreement that would be extremely disadvantageous and tantamount to capitulation. December 18th is once again truly a significant day of destiny for the European community. One can only hope that they, just as in the past, for example during the coronavirus pandemic or in financial crises, will in the end reach an agreement and mobilize the necessary resources to support Ukraine. Max, I'm sure that we'll also make a dedicated shortcut episode about this. Thank you very much for being here today and for explaining everything to us so clearly. Many thanks. That's it for today's episode of Shortcut. You can watch our video podcast on YouTube from Monday to Friday, listen to it as a podcast on all major platforms, and of course find both on spiegel.de. We'll see each other again next time.